Know, O Prince, that between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis, and the gleaming cities, and the years of the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world like blue mantles beneath the stars. Nemedia, Ophir, Brythunia, Hyperborea, Zamora, and its dark-haired women, and towers of spider-haunted mystery, Zingara with its chivalry, Koth that bordered on the pastoral lands of Shim, Stygia with its shadow-guarded tombs, Hyrcania whose riders wore steel and silk and gold. But the proudest kingdom of the world was Aquilonia, reigning supreme in the dreaming west. Hither came Conan the Cimmerian, black-haired, sullen-eyed, sword in hand, a thief, a reaver, a slayer, with gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirth, to tread the jeweled thrones of the earth under his sandaled feet. Robert E. Howard. Welcome to this week's special episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. So, for those of you that are familiar with at least the Conan the Barbarian movies, that monologue sounds a little familiar at least. That is an excerpt from Robert E. Howard's first Conan story. I think it is just Conan the Barbarian is what I read it from. That's a Penguin Publishing version. I think there are a few different ways you can find that. And I'll go into the publication history and that kind of stuff a little bit as well. But yeah, so this week's special spooky season episode focuses on Conan the Barbarian, or Conan the Cimmerian, which is of course, a kind of sword and sorcery hero from a lot of early, I think, 20s and 30s, like Penny Dreadful, pulp magazine type things, which of course was eventually made into a couple of movies starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, as well as games, animated. Like, I think there was a cartoon I've never seen for Conan, but I do think there was one. So yeah, that's what this is about. And first, I guess we should start with the author. Which is Robert Irvin Howard, or Robert E. Howard. He was born in Texas in 1906, and he lived there, I think, his entire life. I know he died there, certainly. But he grew up in a lot of boom towns, at that, also in the Dust Bowl, that kind of time frame. So, pretty rough early life. And he was, I think, pretty much entirely, I wouldn't say self-educated, but he did a lot of extracurricular reading. I think his mother was a big part of that. But he was not just a very bookish person, though he was very bookish. He was also into boxing, bodybuilding, that kind of thing. And he started writing very early. I think his first kind of published work was in the when he was around 20 or 21. But he didn't kind of hit true success until a couple of years after that. He did die very young. He died at the age of 30. He committed suicide. He was very close with his mother, and he had been taking care of her for the last couple of years of his life. And I think she slipped into a coma. He was told she was never going to recover. And he just kind of went out to the car and shot himself after he heard this. And there's some, I've heard some, theories and stuff that, it was some kind of weird edible thing. But I don't think that's the case. There's plenty of evidence that he had been kind of planning this for a while. He had kind of already had his affairs in order well before this happened. So I think he was just kind of waiting till his mother wouldn't be around anymore. It's either to disappoint her or he didn't have to worry about that. So very unfortunate, but he is, or was, I should say, a very prolific writer, and I would say very influential. Probably more influential than a lot of people would realize. But there are criticisms you could make of his work, and people have. He wrote a lot, which is very impressive, and he wrote, I think, and the criticism I see a lot is that people kind of say that he either ate like styles from other, I guess, maybe more famous authors at the time, people like H.P. Lovecraft, who he was in communication with, and they talked a lot back and forth about mythos. And Howard did include some of H.P. Lovecraft's like Cthulhu mythos into his writing. Some of the demons and the great old ones he made a lot of references to. I think Jack London is another person that he's kind of compared to, but just because of the adventure and kind of nature, survivalist elements of his stories. But I think that kind of overlooks some of Howard's own talents. Did he mimic some styles? I mean, sure, I guess possibly, but I don't think anyone could quite tell a story quite like him. He made I guess he was in, I think it might be kind of a good way to say that, like, he was trying to tell stories, these grand adventuring stories, and he just kind of had to get them out as quick as possible. Almost like they were eating away at him, and he just kind of just exploded them onto page in kind of a quick and as fierce a way as he could. And I think that's a kind of a good way to describe his work. But I enjoyed it. I've read a number of the Conan books or short stories, because there are a lot of short stories. I've also read some of his poetry stuff, which is a lot of that's related to some of his Conan things. But he actually has a few different genres. His fantasy work is of course his most famous. But he does he did horror. In fact, I think Stephen King, who did criticize him a little bit, I think he mentioned one of his horror stories was, in Stephen King's opinion, like one of the best horror stories ever written. I forget what it was. I'll see if I can find that quote while I'm kind of going over my notes here. But Conan is not his only fantasy character. He also did Solomon Kane, Kull the Conqueror, which was another. I think they made that into a movie as well. Then there's Bron Morn. So he had a few different kind of characters that serial characters, I guess you'd call them. They show up in a number of different stories. Steve Costigan is one of his pirate swashbuckling characters. So he's got a very large kind of I guess bibliography that he kind of has. And if you'd like to get the Conan, the original books and short stories, there's a few different collections that you can find, because they're not necessarily, they weren't published in order. I think there has been some attempt by some to kind of go back and kind of re-edit them and put them in a kind of a coherent order, or at least a chronological order. That's kind of what I had read. I'd read a part 1 of 3 that had been done. But to kind of get to the specifics of, I guess, Conan the Cimmerian, he is actually not the first character that he created. I think that goes to Kull the Conqueror. And one thing that you should keep in mind with this, Howard, this is not a pure fantasy setting, at least not in the sense you might understand it. Howard was very influenced by a lot of the kind of the sciences of his day, kind of like a lot of popular historical and like mythological theories. I wouldn't be surprised if he had read a lot of like Spengler, which was a German historian. He had a very popular theory at the time of like the rises and falls of civilizations. But again, I know I mentioned it earlier, but Howard was very well read. He understood like a lot of maybe obscure historical references that like H.P. Lovecraft had made in some of his works. Like he made some kind of obscure reference to, I think it was like the Picts. And Howard had written a letter to the editor of the magazine that the work was published in, and he kind of praised Lovecraft's work because of these like very obscure and kind of hidden references and how deep it was. And the editor liked the letter so much, I think he ended up forwarding H.P. Lovecraft, and that's kind of how Robert E. Howard kind of fell into that social circle. And I know that there are those that these days do not, or there's a lot more criticism of Lovecraft these days for some rightfully pretty atrocious racial views, even for his time, which is generally how I feel people should be judged. Even in the time that he lived in, Lovecraft's views were still pretty extreme. Howard does not seem to have had those views. I think he doesn't kind of get nearly as much criticism for his for some of the more shall we say outdated ideas that he puts in his books, because they're not overtly like cruel or demeaning. He definitely believes that that there was some differences between different peoples, but he would never, even in his books, they're not bad compared to Conan. They're just different compared to Conan. And I think in several of his stories, Conan kind of could be considered to be a more bad guy than the people he's sometimes dealing with. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing. Because Conan's not just a straight up and up hero, at least not all the time. He is very much a, well, as we said in the quote at the top of the episode, he was a thief, he was a reaver, among other things. That's not to say he's all good or all bad. He's just, he's very much a very kind of a deep character, or at least a complicated one. Which is why I think he's kind of stuck around in the popular consciousness, even though these days he might not be quite as popular as he had been. But, yeah, so let's talk about the world of Conan, the world that he lives in. The Hyborian Age, or is kind of is the world, I guess, that Conan occupies. And it is... Howard himself, he did like an essay on the Hyborian Age, and he talks about like it being kind of a mythical era before any kind of civilization known to modern day man. It is in Europe and North Africa, like that's where these stories take place. However, there are some unusual geographic features in that kind of thing. There is not a Mediterranean Ocean, Mediterranean Sea. There's several rivers that don't exist. So think of it as like a world where the Mediterranean has not entered into Europe, which, as we know, has been that way for quite a while. And at the time frame that he's setting Conan in, which is, I think some people say it's around 30 anywhere between 30 to like 10,000 BC is kind of when these stories could have happened. The Mediterranean was there. There's no other way around that. But to be fair to Howard, some of his, I guess, theories about how the world would have been shaped at that time, specifically how India and Africa, where they're connected at, he was reflecting kind of what a theory of a very popular theory of what the world would have been like at that time. I don't think plate tectonics, that theory had really been properly developed and vetted yet. So he kind of went with what was popular and what some of the more interesting writers of his day were kind of putting out there. They include, I think, references to like an ancient, like theoretical lost continent of Mu, which would be like east of Southeast Asia, so it's like north of Australia and just off the coast of things like Papua New Guinea and the Philippines. So, just kind of just a little interesting factoid. And of course, there are plenty of references to people mentioned in the Bible, as well as kind of pseudo-historical names like Khitan. Is kind of the land that China is sort of mentioned in. I think Yamatai is mentioned, which is, of course, is ancient Japan. That's one of the words for it. And a lot of the people that are, or groups of people that are mentioned in the stories, they have, they're named for, of course, gods, mythological places. So these people kind of take names, so it's kind of like a connection between our idea of the ancient world and this even earlier version. So like those people's names come down in legend, even if those peoples aren't remembered. And in fact, Hyperborea is a kind of a Greek idea, even for the name. It's like, I think the technical translation is super north land. So it's abbreviated in the story as the Hyborian age, but that comes from the idea of Hyperborea, which was a Greek kind of idea as this. Again, it's literally super Northland, but I think the actual way it's rendered, usually in English, is the land beyond the northern wind is kind of the more artistic way to say that, I guess, for lack of a better term. But it is occupied, Hyboria, occupied by a number of different tribes. You have Conan's people, who are kind of a proto-Celtic people. This has kind of come around from the fact that their god Crom, which is Conan's chief deity of his people, that is kind of a shortened version of a Celtic deity. It could either be Crom Croch or Crom Dub. And those are kind of like there's a couple of different things it could refer to. They're basically like Irish or Pictish versions of like a Celtic, older Celtic god, and they can be kind of represented a few different ways. I really don't want to kind of get too much into the Celtic aspect just yet, because I plan on doing some kind of episodes on those deities specifically. But Crom is definitely one of the higher points of the Conan world building. He's the chief god of the Cimmerians. And he kind of sits in a mountain, and he kind of just looks down and just kind of radiates death and doom and that kind of stuff. And generally don't call upon him. You don't want to ask for his help because he hates weaklings. He's very much a god who helps those who helps themselves, or at least he's a god that doesn't destroy people who help themselves. It might be a better way to describe Crom. In fact, Crom is kind of a little odd. As far as I know, at least in the stories I read, he doesn't really interfere with anything. He doesn't cause any kind of action in the stories. In fact, there's almost no evidence that Crom exists, except in that Conan believes in him. Whereas there are other gods and demons that do have outcomes on the world, specifically the great old ones. I think again, I referenced H.P. Lovecraft earlier. Excuse me. Howard does have those gods, or at least their servants, show up in stories. And in fact, there are other real world deities from ancient peoples that show up, and he connects them as great old ones. He kind of shows them as different as how they actually appeared in our histories. But there are other gods that do show up that are good. I think there is one story where Mitra, which is a god in a few different places, or at least an aspect or kind of similar god to each other in Iran and India. There's a version of Mitra in one of the Conan stories where a princess is trying to save her people from a invading lich, and she prays to the god of her ancestors, and she receives an answer from him saying that she should appoint the first man she meets on the way back home as leader of her army, and of course that's Conan. Spoiler alert, Conan wins the battle, saves her from the lich, so good call by Mitra. Some other aspects about Hyborian. This is not the earliest. Robert E. Howard did the kind of the literary universe. He created his own. He has the Hyborian Age actually takes place in our world, much like his earlier stories with Kull of Atlantis, or Kull the Conqueror. Hyboria takes place after Atlantis sinks into the ocean, as we pointed out from the excerpt at the top of the episode. So Kull's stories take place kind of like, it's supposed to be around 100,000 BCE, give or take. So, Conan takes place after Atlantis has fallen, and they revert to these primitive barbarian tribes. So pretty deep lore for a guy that basically spent 9 years kind of building it out. And even again, I know that there was that criticism with his writing, his maybe not being the most technically proficient, but he tells a good story, and it's nice that he could kind of build that world, with all these kind of desperate and separate kind of ideas from fields that were basically in some ways pseudosciences at the time he's writing. Or at least some of the more popular theories were definitely pseudoscience, shall we say. But to talk about Conan himself, so of course there's the fantastic Conan the Barbarian and the very average Conan the Destroyer that followed afterwards. Those are pretty good movies. I enjoy them both. I know Conan the Destroyer is not nearly as good as Conan the Barbarian, but there was also, I think, the Jason Momoa did was 2010 or 2012, something like that. I haven't seen that movie. I think it's actually very closely related to one of the short stories, whereas at least the first Conan movie, I don't know if that's. I think there are aspects it took from some of the short stories, but I don't remember. At least in the books I've read or listened to from Conan, I don't remember Thulsa Doom, which is James Earl Jones's character, being in any of those. So I need to do a little bit of research. And again, I probably would go back and just do some episodes on those movies. But yes, Conan is a Cimmerian. He is a bit of a scoundrel. I think he's very much in that pre-Tolkien sword and sorcery kind of dynamic where you have thieves breaking into tombs, stealing things, getting rich, fighting. Conan is a pirate in some stories, sailing like rivers and seas on kind of the outskirts of the world that they live in. Then you have, but he does have some good aspects. He is fairly chivalrous for an ancient barbarian. He doesn't like to be in conflict with women if he can help it. Though he does on occasion have to fight sorceresses and things like that. So, but he is generally very deferential to women. Though he is a lover of them and they of him in many situations. And the stories kind of progress. Conan starts as just like a kind of a young vagabond trying to make his way in the world after his tribe was kind of driven into the four corners and broken up. And he is himself the son of a blacksmith. I think that's something that is carried over in the movies. But as time goes on, he kind of progresses from this kind of like just dumb thug almost to a very seasoned warrior and adventurer, and he takes part in like military actions. He kind of joins up as like a kind of a sergeant or second in charge in some cases, and eventually he becomes a leader of warriors and armies in his own right. And he does establish himself as the king of Aquilonia. So he kind of unites this kind of central region that will eventually be flooded by the Mediterranean in the future. But he does this with his own skill and that kind of thing. So I guess you might consider it like the Roman Empire before the Roman Empire, just without the Republic beforehand and just controlled by Conan and I'm assuming his numerous descendants. They did do some continuation stuff for this after I think Howard died. I think there were plenty of stories written after the fact. They kind of bring into some of the more foreign, like Eastern lands that I don't know that Howard himself specifically mentioned. But, there are some very interesting things that Howard included in these stories that were true to life. Things about the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea being more northward than it is now, a little bit larger in the Black Sea. I don't think I know the Black Sea doesn't exist in his world as it does in ours, but at the time it wasn't even a sea, it's a lake. In fact, one of the big things coming up in season 3 is the actual formation of the Black Sea as a sea. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in world building that he included that, based on what we knew at the time, could have been very true. And that's from a layman. That's someone who's just kind of read like pulp. Well, not pulp, but kind of just very theoretical and speculative works by very learned or semi-learned professionals in that field, I guess, at the time. But yeah, the world he was growing up in, Howard was growing up in, it was a rough one, especially in Texas at that point. There were a lot of oil towns booming at that time, and there's a lot of crime and just corruption from a lot of local officials, especially lack of corruption being able to be curtailed by state and federal officials. You had a lot of conflicts between, forces that ideally should have been working together to kind of curb those excesses, but so it was kind of a rough and tumble world, and that kind of shows, in some of his stories. Conan's almost in some ways a Western, and I think Howard did do some Westerns as well, but there are a lot of tropes in some of the Conan stories, or at least that I don't think showed up prior to him, or at least he may have developed some older tropes to kind of fit a more modern narrative and kind of hit them well enough. And I think some people have kind of taken that from those stories and kind of incorporated in their own things. But I highly recommend Conan, especially if you're trying to maybe get a younger boy interested in reading. There are some stories that would be appropriate for maybe a 10 to 12 year old. Some might be a little less appropriate. Maybe you want to wait until they're maybe in their mid-teens, but hell, just let them read everything. I don't think you'd cause too much problems. They're very interesting. The world's great. There are a lot of good horror elements for it. The gods, the demons Conan has to fight and deal with. But yeah, I think I do want to kind of go a little bit more in depth for some of these. I think for maybe some future kind of bonus episodes, that might be something to talk about. But yeah, so I do thank you for listening. I hope this maybe gets you thinking about reading those Howard's stories. There are some decent continuations from my understanding for Conan. I haven't read any of them. I've only read the Howard ones. Of course, they were comic books for a time as well. I think they tried to reboot it recently, but from what I understand, it wasn't actually focused on Conan too much. It was kind of focused on more characters and Conan just kind of shows up in the stories and wrecks shit and things like that. But yeah. It's a shame that they really haven't been able to get it too popular since then, but I recommend them. I'd say 8.5 out of 10 for the ones I've read, which again I think it's like the first third of the Howard books or stories, but I'm actually in the process. I probably, once I finish a book I'm reading through now for season 3, I will probably start listening to the Conan book after my research is done. That's generally how I do things these days. I'll read a book or listen to a book for research, kind of compile all that stuff, and then once it comes time to actually script and plot things out, I'll switch to something that's a little bit more relaxing or fun reading as opposed to learning reading. So I'm kind of on this cycle right now. Next week, for the Halloween episode, I'm actually thinking of reviewing a, believe it or not, a K-drama set kind of in a prehistorical Korea. I need to watch, it'll probably be on just the first 1 or 2 episodes. I don't know if it's ahistorical, but I do think there are a lot of, I do think there are some supernatural elements to it. I'm not sure. I myself am not that familiar with Korean television. I am a big fan of Korean horror. There have been some very good Korean horror movies that came out, within the last 5 to 10 years. Of course, Parasite was a big hit. That's not necessarily horror per se, But things like The Host, Last Train to Busan, I'm more familiar, at least when it comes to Asian stuff, I'm more familiar with Japanese TV and movies. But I have watched some Korean films, so I'm kind of looking forward to this. I want to see how they kind of do that. But that will probably be next week's episode. And then we will have just one more kind of spooky season episode after that. And then we'll be back to the regular podcast for a time. In fact, I would not be surprised if we'll have some bonus episodes, of course, in the within this time frame, a little bit after that. But I think season 3 is probably going to take. I wouldn't be surprised if it's at least half this year coming up. It may be 6 months total, give or take. Maybe a little bit more than that. I'm still, right now I've gotten most of the African episodes kind of plotted out. But I think when you include everything else, there's a whole lot to go into. I may have to start kind of culling to not cover quite as long of a period of time. Anyway, I'm still thinking about it. I just kind of want to keep everyone updated. But yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed the Conan episode, the Hyborian Age. I hope you get tempted to read it a little. And again, I think I am going to go in depth on a little of these. That might be something to do for a bonus episode, maybe around Christmas or something around those times. But we'll see. It will happen at some point or another. But anyway, I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope you'll be back for next week's episode. And I hope you will also listen to the normal episode of the podcast, which will be coming out same day as this one. I think this one's going to come out probably in Monday afternoon, and of course the normal or the regular episode will be out. I've already had that scheduled. It'll be out at the normal time, which is 1 a.m. Eastern. But thank you all. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.